The fluorescent lights of the 42nd floor hummed their usual monotonous song as Rachel Torres sat at her desk, pretending to work on the Henderson account spreadsheet. In reality, her stomach was doing somersaults. She'd caught a glimpse of him 5 minutes ago. Brandon, her ex-boyfriend of 2 years, walking through the lobby with that infuriating smirk, talking loudly on his phone like he owned the place. He didn't, of course. He was just another finance bro in an ill-fitting suit, but somehow he always managed to make her feel small. She'd worked so hard to move past him. The sleepless nights, the constant replaying of conversations, the way she'd convinced herself that she'd never be enough for anyone. All of it was supposed to be behind her now. 6 months of therapy, a new apartment in Brooklyn, a yoga class she actually enjoyed. Rachel had rebuilt herself into someone competent, someone who showed up on time and delivered good work and didn't cry in the bathroom stall anymore. Then Brandon walked back into her life like he had every right to be there. Her phone buzzed, a text from her friend Mira. "Is that Brandon? OMG, I'm seeing him at the reception desk." Rachel's jaw clenched. The reception desk was 3 floors down. He was coming up. She stared at her computer screen, watching the blinking cursor mock her. She could hide at her desk. She could pretend she was busy, important, unavailable. But Brandon had a way of finding people. He'd always been like that, relentless, intrusive, convinced that the world revolved around his need for attention. Her heart rate accelerated as the elevator chimed. 4th floor, 5th floor, no. She wouldn't do this. She wouldn't sit here and wait for him to stride over to her cubicle with that self-satisfied expression, making some cutting remark about her job or her appearance or her life choices. Not today. Not when she'd finally started to feel like herself again. Rachel grabbed her cardigan from the back of her chair and moved quickly toward the corridor. The stairwell would take too long. The bathroom was predictable. But the elevator, if she timed it right, she could catch the next one down and slip out through the south exit before he even made it to the 42nd floor. Her heels clicked urgently against the polished tile as she walked, not quite running but moving with the kind of focused determination that came from pure adrenaline. The elevator bank loomed ahead, 3 silver doors gleaming under the bright office lights. She jabbed the down button and held her breath. The middle doors slid open immediately. Rachel didn't look inside. She simply stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the floor numbers, already composing a mental escape route. She'd go to that coffee shop on Madison, the quiet one where nobody from the office went. She'd sit for an hour, drink something expensive and unnecessarily complicated, and by the time she came back, Brandon would either be gone or forgotten about her entirely. The elevator doors began to close. "Hold that, please." Rachel's stomach dropped. It wasn't Brandon's voice. It was deeper, more authoritative, carrying the kind of tone that suggested the speaker was accustomed to people holding elevators for him. She glanced up reflexively. A man stepped inside. Tall, early 30s, with dark hair and the kind of face that looked like it had been carved specifically to make expensive suits look even more expensive. He wore a charcoal gray 3-piece ensemble that probably cost more than her monthly rent. And his watch. God, his watch alone could probably pay off her student loans. David Harrington, her boss. Her boss of 18 months. The man whose company memo she'd read that morning, without fully processing it. The man whose name appeared on the company letterhead and the plaques on the wall. She'd seen him perhaps a dozen times in person, always from a distance, always in these elevators or passing through the office floor like a ghost in a tailored jacket, barely registering the existence of the workers below his pay grade. Rachel's face went hot. She turned quickly, staring at the floor numbers with an intensity usually reserved for things that actually mattered. She was suddenly hyper-aware of everything. The slight humidity of the elevator, the faint smell of his cologne, something clean and woody, the soft rustle of fabric as he shifted his weight. Was her cardigan wrinkled? Did she have coffee stains on her blouse? Why was she thinking about coffee stains when she was actively fleeing her ex-boyfriend like a fugitive? "Going down?" David asked. His voice was polite, almost neutral, the kind of thing you say to anyone in an elevator because it's the social contract. Yes, Rachel said, her voice embarrassingly high. She cleared her throat. Yes, down. The doors sealed shut with a soft hiss. The elevator began its descent. Rachel counted the floor numbers in her head. 41, 40, 39. She was almost safe, almost invisible. Almost Rachel, isn't it? She turned, startled. David was looking at her with something that might have been curiosity, or might have been the polite interest you extend to any human being you're forced to share an enclosed space with for 30 seconds. Yes, sir, she said. Rachel Torres, administrative support, 42nd floor. I know. He smiled slightly, and it transformed his face into something less intimidating and somehow more troubling. You filled in for Patricia last month on the Breslin presentation. Good work. Rachel blinked. She had no idea he'd even been at that presentation. She'd assumed it was just the senior analysts, that no one above a certain pay grade would bother attending something so routine. Thank you, she managed. Thank you. 35, 34. How are you settling in? David asked. You've been with us for a while now, but I realize I haven't actually spoken to you properly. This was surreal. This was genuinely surreal. Rachel had spent the past year and a half being essentially invisible to this man, and now he was making small talk about her professional integration into the company. She could feel her shoulders relaxing slightly, the adrenaline from the Brandon situation beginning to metabolize into something else, something that felt dangerously like gratitude. I'm settling in well, she said, managing an almost normal smile. Everyone on the 42nd floor has been very welcoming. Good. He nodded, glancing back at the floor numbers. Mira speaks highly of you, says you're organized, reliable, catch details others miss. Rachel's eyebrows rose. Mira had mentioned her to David Harrington. Mira, her deskmate, the woman who spent half her day on Instagram and the other half complaining about the office coffee? Mira's been a great colleague, Rachel said carefully. 28, 27. The elevator hummed. David was quiet now, and Rachel found herself wondering if he'd already forgotten about her, if he was thinking about whatever important business occupied the minds of men like him. She should probably be relieved. She should probably go back to her mental escape plan, her coffee shop refuge, her careful reconstruction of normalcy. Instead, she found herself stealing a glance at him. He was looking at the floor numbers with the same focus she'd been using moments before, his expression neutral, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. There was something almost lonely about the way he stood. Not physically alone, of course, but carrying the kind of solitude that came from existing at the top of things. No one to report to, no one to really talk to, everyone always measuring their words in your presence. It was a strange moment of clarity, and Rachel didn't entirely trust it. 15, 14. The office culture could use some, David began, then stopped abruptly. A sound had come from above them, a kind of mechanical grinding noise followed by a sharp electrical pop. The elevator lurched. Rachel's stomach dropped a second time that day, and this time it stayed there. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out entirely. The elevator fell silent, not moving, not humming, just silent. Emergency lighting kicked in after a moment, bathing the small space in a faint red glow that made everything look vaguely apocalyptic. "What the hell?" Rachel whispered. "Power issue," David said, his voice steady in a way that suggested he was either very calm or very practiced at sounding calm in crisis situations. The backup system should, but they didn't. The elevator remained perfectly, absolutely still at what Rachel's count suggested was approximately the 10th floor, neither ascending nor descending, just trapped between worlds. David moved toward the panel of buttons and pressed the emergency call button with his index finger. Nothing happened. He tried again. Still nothing. "Well," he said after a moment, and Rachel could hear the slightest edge of dry amusement in his voice. "This is unexpected." Rachel stared at the red-lit walls of their metal prison and thought about Brandon, probably at this very moment settling into someone's office for a meeting. She thought about how she'd been running from one problem and landed directly into another. She thought about how the universe had a very specific sense of humor and how it was usually at her expense. "Yeah," she said quietly. "You could say that." The elevator held them in its mechanical embrace, 60 stories above the street, 60 stories below the sky, and neither of them had any idea how long they would stay there. 20 minutes passed. Rachel knew this because she'd checked her phone obsessively, 7 times to be exact, watching the minutes tick by with the kind of anxiety usually reserved for root canal appointments. The emergency call button remained unresponsive no matter how many times David pressed it. He'd tried it roughly 12 times before accepting defeat, and now he stood with his back against the elevator wall, arms crossed, looking remarkably unbothered for a man who was currently imprisoned in a metal box. Rachel, by contrast, was beginning to spiral. She'd moved to the opposite wall, as far from David as the small space would allow, which meant they were approximately 5 feet apart in what felt like a sensory deprivation chamber designed specifically for her torture. The red emergency lighting cast everything in shades of crimson and shadow, making the space feel smaller with each passing minute. Her cardigan felt too warm. The air felt too thin. Brandon was definitely upstairs by now, probably leaving messages on everyone's phone, probably telling the story of how Rachel had run away like she always did when things got difficult. "The building has backup generators," David said, breaking the silence. "They should kick in automatically. Someone will notice the outage and dispatch maintenance within the hour." "Within the hour," Rachel repeated, her voice slightly strangled. "So we could be here for up to an hour. Potentially. In this elevator." "Yes." Rachel closed her eyes. She could feel a panic attack creeping around the edges of her consciousness like a cat deciding whether to jump. She'd had panic attacks before, usually at 3 in the morning, usually involving spiral thoughts about her life choices, but never in such a confined space with her millionaire boss as a witness. "Are you claustrophobic?" David asked. Rachel opened her eyes. He was watching her with an expression of mild concern, which was somehow worse than if he'd just ignored her obvious distress. "A little," she admitted. "Not usually, but I'm not great with enclosed spaces." "Sit down," David suggested, and without waiting for her response, he slid down the wall until he was sitting on the elevator floor, his expensive suit making contact with the metal surface without so much as a wince. Rachel stared at him. "Seriously?" she said. "Seriously, sitting helps. Lying down would help more, but I suspect you'd find that undignified." "I'd find sitting on a dirty elevator floor undignified," Rachel pointed out, though her legs were already beginning to feel shaky. "It's probably not dirty. This building is cleaned obsessively. I made sure of that." David gestured to the space next to him. "Come on, panic is worse when you're standing. All the blood pools in your legs makes you dizzy." Rachel wanted to argue, wanted to maintain some kind of professional distance, wanted to pretend that she wasn't currently seconds away from either crying or hyperventilating or both. But David was right about the blood pooling thing. She could feel it happening, a strange, light-headed sensation creeping in at the edges. She slowly slid down the opposite wall until she was sitting, her knees drawn up slightly, her back against the cool metal. It did help, marginally. The immediate vertigo receded, replaced by something less acute but more persistent, a general sense of unreality. "Better?" David asked. "Marginally," Rachel admitted. They sat in silence for another few minutes. Rachel became aware of things she'd previously ignored. The faint smell of the air recycling system, the almost imperceptible vibration of the building around them, the sound of her own breathing, which she was now hyper-aware of and couldn't seem to regulate. "What were you running from?" David asked suddenly. Rachel's head snapped toward him. "What?" "When you got on the elevator. You were clearly running from something, or someone. How did you? You weren't looking where you were going. You nearly walked into the elevator wall before you registered I was there. You've been vibrating with adrenaline ever since." He said it matter-of-factly, like he was describing the weather. "You also checked your phone 3 times in the last 5 minutes, which suggests you're either expecting urgent news or avoiding someone." Rachel felt her face flush. "That's very observant. I pay attention to details. It's useful in my line of work." He paused. "You don't have to tell me, but talking might help with the panic." This was insane. This was absolutely insane. Rachel was supposed to be invisible to this man. She was supposed to fill spreadsheets and attend meetings and exist in the background of his professional world. They were not supposed to be sitting on an elevator floor like 2 people on a therapy session. But she also desperately wanted to not have a panic attack in front of him. "My ex-boyfriend," she heard herself say. "He came to the office. I saw him in the lobby and I didn't want to see him, so I ran." "Ah," David said. "That explains the flight response." "Is that a judgment?" Rachel asked defensively. "No, it's understanding." He shifted slightly, finding a more comfortable position against the wall. "I've had the same impulse before. There's someone I know who I've been avoiding for about 3 years now. Takes considerable effort to ensure our paths don't cross." Rachel turned to look at him properly for the first time since they'd sat down. In the red emergency lighting, he looked less like an untouchable corporate deity and more like a regular person, tired around the eyes, lines around his mouth that suggested he smiled more than his professional demeanor indicated. "Really?" she said. "Really? Power doesn't make you immune to wanting to avoid awkward situations. Sometimes it makes you more aware of them, because people are always watching how you respond." Rachel considered this. She'd never really thought about what it might be like to be David Harrington, to exist at the top of the corporate hierarchy, where every reaction was analyzed, every decision dissected, every moment a potential photograph in someone else's mental gallery. "Is that why you're always alone?" The question escaped before she could consider whether it was appropriate. "I mean, I've noticed you're usually by yourself, even in meetings with lots of people." "That's one reason," David said. "The other reasons are more complicated and involve my own particular issues with trust and emotional availability, which I'm currently working through with a therapist who costs an obscene amount of money and yet still doesn't have any actual answers for me." Rachel let out a surprised laugh. It wasn't a gentle sound. It came out a bit too loud in the small space, a bit too genuine given the circumstances. "That's very honest," she said. "We're trapped in an elevator during a power outage. I figure normal social rules have been suspended." David smiled slightly. "Also, you're going to hear about this disaster on the office grapevine regardless, so I might as well be the first to establish that I handle crisis with dignity and dry humor." "You're establishing that by admitting your therapist doesn't have answers for you?" "Everyone's therapist doesn't have answers for them. It's the whole point of therapy. You work on not needing answers so urgently." He paused. "That probably doesn't make sense." "No, it kind of does," Rachel said. "My therapist says something similar, except she phrases it as learning to sit with discomfort, which makes it sound like I'm auditioning for a meditation retreat." "Are you?" "Am I what?" "Learning to sit with discomfort, given the whole panic attack in an elevator situation." Rachel considered lying, considered giving some professional response about how she was working on things and making progress. Instead, she said, "I was doing fine until Brandon showed up. He's good at making me feel like I'm not doing fine. Like I'll never do fine. Like the things I've built, my job, my apartment, my general sense of okayness about being alive, are all just temporary scaffolding that's going to collapse the second someone like him walks into a room." The words hung in the elevator air, and Rachel immediately regretted them. She'd just unloaded several years of emotional baggage onto her millionaire boss in a metal box. This was a new low, professionally speaking, but David didn't look uncomfortable. If anything, he looked more relaxed, like he'd just heard something genuine and was relieved by it. "He's wrong," David said simply. "You don't know that. I know that you filled in for Patricia Breslin on a presentation I actually attended. Do you know who Patricia Breslin is?" "Everyone on the 42nd floor knows who Patricia Breslin is. She's been here for 12 years, and everyone respects her." "Exactly. And you stepped into her role for one afternoon, and you did well enough that I remembered it 18 months later in an elevator. That doesn't happen because you're scaffolding. That happens because you're actually capable." David shifted so he was looking at her more directly. "Also, you just admitted your insecurities to a relative stranger in a trapped elevator. That takes the opposite of someone with shaky foundations. That takes someone secure enough to be vulnerable." Rachel felt something shift in her chest. Not dramatically, not in the way they do in romantic comedies, but in a quiet, genuine way that felt almost more significant. "My ex told me I was too ambitious," she said carefully. "Said I used work as an excuse not to deal with real life. When I wanted to move, he said I was running away. When I started therapy, he said I was being dramatic. When I finally broke up with him, he told everyone that I was incapable of real intimacy. And now he's shown up at your office to get some file or some bullshit excuse. But really, I think it's because he heard I was doing well. He heard through mutual friends that I was happy, and he couldn't stand that." David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you want to know something about people like that? What? They need you to be small, not because you actually are small, but because your smallness gives them permission to be small too. The second you stop fitting into that role, they panic. They try to pull you back because your freedom reminds them of their own compromises." "Is that what your person does?" Rachel asked. "The one you've been avoiding?" "Something similar, yes." David looked away toward the dark elevator doors. "Though my version is more complicated by blood relation and inheritance law." Rachel wanted to ask more, but something in his body language suggested he'd hit his limit on personal revelation, so instead she said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For the pep talk, for the perspective, for not acting like I'm crazy, for running from my ex, like I'm being pursued by a serial killer. You're not crazy. You're human. Humans run from things that hurt them." He paused. "Ideally, not forever. Ideally, you run until you're far enough away that the hurt stops echoing, and then you turn around and keep living your life. But the running part is fine. The running part is necessary." Checked. The elevator remained silent and motionless around them. Rachel's panic had receded, replaced by something less acute but oddly more significant. A strange sense of being understood by someone who absolutely shouldn't be able to understand her. After another stretch of time that might have been 5 minutes or 20 minutes, Rachel had stopped checking. David said, "I'm going to tell you something that's absolutely inappropriate for a boss to say to an employee." "Okay," Rachel said cautiously. "You should probably not take the regular coffee breaks everyone else does. I've noticed you bring your own coffee, and you always seem embarrassed about it, like you're doing something wrong, but you're not. You're being intentional about something small, which is how people maintain their well-being when they work in places like this. Don't stop doing that because you think you're supposed to be more casual or more social. The coffee is fine, the intentionality is better." Rachel stared at him. "Did you just give me unsolicited advice about my coffee habits?" "I did. Was it unwelcome?" "No," she said slowly. "Actually, it was kind of perfect." Another stretch of silence. And then, because she was apparently committed to the total destruction of professional boundaries, "Can I ask you something that's absolutely inappropriate for an employee to ask their boss? Please, why are you so good at this, at understanding things people don't say out loud?" David smiled. A real smile this time, not the polite corporate version she'd seen him deploy in meetings. "Because I've spent most of my life learning to compensate for being terrible at saying the things I feel directly," he said. So I got very good at reading what was happening under the surface. It's not really a gift. It's more like a defense mechanism that eventually became useful. That's very self-aware. That's what the expensive therapist is for. Rachel laughed again, and this time it felt easier. Less like a desperate escape from panic and more like genuine amusement. They sat together in the red-lit elevator. Two people from completely different worlds, separated by corporate hierarchy and professional boundaries that seemed increasingly irrelevant in a trapped metal box. Outside, the building hummed with normal activity. Somewhere above them, Brandon was probably leaving. Somewhere below them, the generators were presumably being assessed. Somewhere in the space between those 2 points, Rachel and David were having a conversation that would have been impossible anywhere else. "Do you want to know something?" Rachel said after a while. "Always. I'm still panicking a little, but it's better now. Not because of breathing techniques or anything logical, just because someone who didn't have to listen to my disaster did anyway." That's what people are supposed to do," David said simply. "Help each other. It's not noble or special. It's just human." The elevator remained motionless, holding them in its small red world, and Rachel realized that for the first time since her panic had started, she wasn't thinking about escaping. An hour had passed, then 90 minutes. The red emergency lighting had begun to feel less apocalyptic and more like the ambient color of their shared reality. Rachel's panic had fully dissolved into something else, a strange kind of acceptance mixed with an awareness that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. She'd moved from her wall to a position roughly 3 feet from David, their legs stretched out in front of them in a way that would have felt intimate if they weren't both desperately pretending it wasn't. They'd exhausted most of the safe conversational topics: the office, the weather, which they could theoretically see if the doors were transparent, but they weren't, the merits of different coffee shops in Manhattan, whether the building's cafeteria had actually improved or if they'd just gotten used to mediocrity. Now they were in that strange territory where you've moved past small talk but haven't quite established what the new parameters are. "Tell me about the person you're avoiding," Rachel said. "The one with the blood relation." David was quiet for a long moment. His head was tilted back against the wall, his eyes closed, and Rachel wondered if he was about to deflect or if he was actually considering her question. "My father," he finally said. "He built the company that I now technically run, though run is generous. I mostly maintain it and try to pretend I'm not slowly dying from the weight of other people's expectations." "That's dramatic," Rachel said. "It's accurate." He opened his eyes and looked at her. "He had very specific ideas about what I should be doing with the company. I have different ideas." He decided that the best way to express his disappointment was to be present at as many meetings as possible, undermining my decisions and reminding everyone that I'm essentially a caretaker of his legacy rather than a leader in my own right. How long did that go on? 3 years before I told him he wasn't welcome in my offices anymore. He took it well, by which I mean he issued a public statement about how I'm throwing away my inheritance and my family legacy for my own personal indulgences. What personal indulgences? Wanting to implement sustainable business practices. Wanting to hire based on merit and diversity rather than legacy connections. Wanting to pay people fairly. Apparently, these are indulgences of the morally corrupt. He smiled without humor. He cut off most family contact after that. My mother still tries to mediate. It's exhausting. Rachel considered this. She'd always assumed that people like David Harrington, wealthy, powerful, successful, had things easier. But family dysfunction didn't care about net worth. Payne didn't have a corporate tax bracket. "Do you want him to come back?" she asked. "No," David said immediately. Then, more slowly, "Not as he was. I wouldn't mind if he could accept that I'm going to run things differently than he did, but he can't. For him, my success is only valid if it replicates his choices, so we exist in this standoff where I'm the villain for having a different vision. That's not fair. Life rarely is," He paused. What about your ex? Is there any scenario where you want him back? God, no, Rachel said. But I also don't want him at my office making me feel like everything I've built is fragile, which is apparently what's going to happen repeatedly until I either get over it or change jobs. You're not getting a new job because of him. I wasn't planning to, Rachel agreed, but he has a way of making me question whether I should be somewhere. Like my mere presence is somehow causing problems for other people. Is it? Is what? Causing problems. Objectively. Rachel thought about this. No, I'm good at what I do. People like working with me. I'm responsible and I follow through on things. Then his narrative is his problem, not yours. Logically, I know that. Emotionally, it's harder. Most things are, David said. Logic and emotion rarely occupy the same space. Usually they're actively at war with each other. They lapsed into silence again. Rachel became aware that she'd shifted position slightly so that her knee was almost touching his. She pulled back slightly, suddenly concerned about what that proximity might imply, and immediately felt foolish. They were trapped in an elevator. Proximity was inevitable. Except it wasn't necessary to be this close. There was enough space to sit further apart if she wanted to. She didn't move back further. Can I ask you something inappropriate? David asked. You're allowed to ask. I'm allowed to decline to answer. Fair. He turned his head to look at her. Is this better or worse than your regular day? Rachel considered the question seriously. Her regular day involved spreadsheets and meetings, and the constant low-level anxiety of working in an environment where she felt like she was supposed to be invisible. Today involved a power outage, entrapment, and a conversation with her boss that had somehow become one of the most genuine interactions she'd had in months. Better, she said honestly, which is probably a sign that my regular life needs adjustment. Or a sign that you're in the wrong environment for who you actually are. What do you mean? David shifted so he was facing her more directly. The movement brought them closer than they'd been, close enough that Rachel could see the subtle color variation in his eyes, more gray than pure blue, with darker rings around the iris. You're someone who thinks deeply about things, he said. You notice details. You care about doing things well, even things nobody would blame you for doing badly. An office where that's treated as invisible isn't the right fit for you. Are you offering me a promotion, or are you suggesting I should quit? Rachel asked, her voice carefully light. I'm suggesting that you might want to think about whether you're actually happy, or if you're just used to pretending to be okay with things that don't serve you. The irony of him saying this, trapped in an elevator where he himself worked at a job he'd just described as slowly killing him, wasn't lost on Rachel. You could take your own advice, she pointed out. I could, David agreed. But I'm much more successful at dispensing wisdom than I am at implementing it. It's a common flaw in people who've had therapy. Rachel laughed. Is that actually true, or are you just being self-deprecating? Both, probably. Self-deprecation is often just honesty with a comedic wrapper. He reached over and tucked a strand of hair that had fallen across her face back behind her ear, a gesture that was so casual and so intimate that Rachel's breath caught. When he pulled his hand away, neither of them acknowledged what had just happened. I should tell you something, Rachel said quietly. Professionally speaking, it's probably a mistake, but also I think you should know it. Okay. When I first started working here, I was terrified of you. I didn't know anything about you except that you wore expensive suits and appeared in the building like you owned it, which technically you did, but you seemed untouchable, unreachable, like you existed on a completely different plane from everyone else. And now I think you're probably one of the loneliest people in this building. And I don't think it's because of the power or the money or the job. I think it's because you've built these walls that are so high that the only people who can climb them are people you've already decided to let in. And that's not many people. David was quiet for a long time. Rachel began to worry that she'd overstepped, that she'd said something inappropriately personal that would cause him to retreat back into the professional distance he'd maintained until today. But when he spoke, his voice was soft. "You're right," he said. "I have built walls, and they were built for reasons. To protect myself from disappointment, from people wanting things from me that I couldn't give them, from ending up like my father, treating relationships like transactions. But somewhere along the way, the walls stopped protecting me and started imprisoning me. That's a very poetic way to describe it. That's what happens when you go to therapy. You become able to articulate your dysfunction with emotional precision, which is somehow worse than just being oblivious about it." Rachel smiled. But underneath the humor, something was happening. Something that had started in the first hour of their entrapment, but was now becoming impossible to ignore. It was the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't noticing. It was the careful distance he was maintaining when he'd actually want to be closer. It was the way he'd tucked her hair back, like it was something he'd been wanting to do for months. And it was terrifying because Rachel understood, with absolute clarity, that this was the kind of attraction that didn't stay contained. This was the kind of attraction that followed you out of elevators and into elevators and through hallways and into conference rooms. This was the kind of attraction that made it impossible to be professional and invisible and safe. "Tell me about your ex," David said, pulling her out of her thoughts. "The one you were running from. What made him tell everyone you were incapable of real intimacy?" "He said that I got close to people, but never let them actually touch the vulnerable parts," Rachel said. "He said I kept everyone at arm's length, that I was charming but distant, that I used my intelligence and competence as a shield." Was he right? Partially. "I think I am careful about who I let in, but I don't think that makes me incapable of intimacy. I think it makes me sane. Why would I let someone close who's going to use what they know against me? Because sometimes the risk is worth it," David said quietly. Their eyes met, and Rachel felt something shift in the small red space between them. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a moment where the world suddenly made sense or the music swelled. It was quieter than that, a moment of recognition, of two people seeing each other clearly and understanding that what they were seeing was dangerous in the best possible way. Rachel's phone buzzed. The first technological intrusion since they'd entered the elevator together. She pulled it out and saw a message from Mira. Still no word on the elevator. "Maintenance is saying it's a bigger issue than expected. You okay?" "It's work," Rachel said, showing David the message. "They're still trying to fix the elevator." "How long have we been in here?" David asked. Rachel checked the time. "Almost 2 hours. That's both longer and shorter than I expected." "How do you measure time, subjectively like that?" "The same way you did. It felt like 5 minutes because of the conversation. It also felt like 2 hours because of the physical constraints." He paused. "Mostly it felt like I was having the kind of conversation I haven't had in years, and that distorted my sense of time entirely." Rachel's heart was doing something that felt medically inadvisable. "We should probably not do whatever this is," she said carefully. "Given the power dynamic and the fact that you're technically my employer and the entire situation is inherently compromised." "Probably not," David agreed. "It would be unprofessional. Extremely unprofessional. There are actual HR implications to this. I'm aware. And yet," Rachel said, "here we are." "Here we are," David confirmed. He reached out again, this time more deliberately, and took her hand. His fingers were warm and slightly calloused, and when he held her hand, it felt like both the most natural thing that had ever happened and the most dangerous decision she'd ever made. "If we do this," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper, "it can't be about the elevator. It can't be about being trapped and vulnerable and having no other option. It has to be real." "It is real," David said. "I know it's happening in strange circumstances, but what I feel right now is real. That doesn't change when the elevator doors open." "How can you be sure?" "I can't," he admitted, "but I'm willing to find out." The elevator remained silent around them. holding them in its small space, and Rachel made a decision that would echo far beyond the doors when they finally opened. She leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't the kind of kiss you see in movies. There were no violins, no sudden clarity, no moment where the universe reorganized itself. It was tender and uncertain, and tasted slightly like the coffee they'd been drinking from his emergency supply. It was imperfect and real, and absolutely terrifying. When they pulled apart, David's forehead rested against hers. "That was inadvisable," he whispered. "Extremely inadvisable," Rachel agreed. "I'm going to regret the professional complications. Almost certainly. But I don't regret the kiss." "Neither do I," Rachel said. Above them, far above in the normal world where elevators worked and people moved between floors without existential crises, the building continued its regular rhythm. But inside their small red capsule, everything had shifted. The safety they'd both been maintaining, professional distance, emotional walls, the carefully constructed boundaries that made corporate life possible, had been fundamentally compromised. And somehow, trapped between the 42nd floor and the 10th, neither of them wanted to rebuild those walls. The elevator doors slid open at 3:47 in the afternoon, and reality rushed in like a tide. For a moment, Rachel and David remained seated on the floor, neither quite ready to leave the small red world they'd constructed. Then David stood first, extending a hand to help Rachel up. She took it, and the simple gesture felt loaded with significance. This was the first time they would move together into the external world, the first moment where what had happened in the elevator would have to exist outside its contained space. They emerged on the 23rd floor, where a small maintenance crew was waiting with concerned expressions. A woman in a building uniform immediately approached them. "Are you both okay? We've been trying to get the backup systems online for the past 3 hours. The generators aren't responding to the restart sequence. We're waiting for the electrical company to send someone from outside." "We're fine," David said, his voice immediately shifting into the professional register Rachel had heard in meetings. "No injuries. We were fortunate to have water and emergency lighting." The woman nodded, looking relieved. "We'll need to get statements from both of you for the incident report. Building insurance requires documentation." "Of course," David said. He glanced at Rachel briefly, and she saw something flicker across his face, an awareness that the normal rules were reasserting themselves. "Rachel, you should go home. This has been traumatic enough without paperwork." It was the right thing to say. It was also the safest thing to say. It was the move of someone already recalibrating to professional distance. "I should probably give a statement too," Rachel said carefully, "since I was involved." "You can do that tomorrow. I'll make sure someone takes your account remotely." His tone had become progressively more formal, like he was actively rebuilding the walls she'd thought they'd demolished. "Take the rest of the day, go home, have a drink, process." Rachel wanted to argue. She wanted to say that processing was going to be infinitely harder if they retreated into professional distance immediately. But they were standing in an open hallway with building maintenance staff observing them, and the moment for that conversation wasn't now. "Okay," she said quietly. "Thank you." The drive from Manhattan to her apartment in Brooklyn felt longer than it actually was. Rachel kept replaying the elevator conversation in her head, trying to determine what had been real and what had been circumstance. They'd been trapped. They'd been vulnerable. They'd had nothing to lose in that moment because the external world was suspended. But the external world wasn't suspended anymore. She made it home and immediately changed out of her office clothes, trading her professional attire for sweats and a Columbia hoodie that had belonged to her ex, a fact she'd been trying to ignore for 6 months. She pulled it off and threw it in a donation pile with more force than necessary. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Hi, it's David. I got your number from HR. I know this might be inappropriate, but I wanted to talk to you outside of the office context." Rachel stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Hi. Yeah, I think we need to talk, but probably not via text." The response came immediately. Agreed. Are you free tonight? I'd like to see you. Rachel's heart did something that felt medically inadvisable again. She should say no. She should establish boundaries. She should remember that he was her boss and that this was genuinely complicated. Instead, she typed, "Where?" They met at a coffee shop in Brooklyn that Rachel had mentioned during their elevator conversation, the quiet one on Madison where nobody from the office went. It was a small, deliberately underlit space with mismatched furniture and a barista who didn't judge people who ordered the same complicated drink every day. Rachel arrived first and claimed a corner table, her stomach doing anxious flips. David arrived 10 minutes later, looking deliberately undressed down for him. No three-piece suit. Just dark jeans and a grey sweater that made his eyes look more grey than blue. He looked smaller somehow, or maybe just more human, less like a corporate deity, and more like a person who'd been thinking about an elevator for the past 4 hours. He ordered coffee without looking at the menu, then sat across from her. "I've been having a conversation with myself about this all afternoon," he said without preamble, "and I've reached approximately 17 different conclusions, most of them contradictory." "That's fair," Rachel said. "I've been having approximately the same conversation." "What did you conclude?" Rachel wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, using it as a small barrier between them. "That what happened in the elevator was real, but that the circumstances were fundamentally compromised. That we can't base anything on it, because we don't actually know if this is genuine, or if we're both experiencing some kind of trauma bonding from being trapped." "That's very logical," David said. David. "It's also completely true, and also completely terrifying, because I think what happened might have been more real than anything I've felt in a long time." She looked up at him. "How did you conclude?" "I concluded that I'm probably going to make a huge mistake, but it's going to be one of the few mistakes in my life that I make because I actually want something, not because I'm supposed to want it, and that's worth the risk. Even with the professional complications." "I can transfer you to a different department," David said. "It's not ideal, and it's not without its own complications, but it's possible, or I can recuse myself from your performance evaluations. There are ways to manage the optics of this that don't involve either of us losing our jobs or careers." "You've thought about this," Rachel observed. "I've thought about almost nothing else since the elevator doors opened." He leaned forward slightly. "Rachel, I'm aware that this is complicated. I'm aware that there's a power dynamic and that the circumstances were unusual and that we're both potentially experiencing chemical reactions to vulnerability. But I also know that I haven't felt this clear about wanting something in years, and I would genuinely regret not exploring that because of logistics." Rachel's therapist would probably have a lot to say about this moment. Something about recognizing healthy versus unhealthy relationship patterns, about making sure she wasn't abandoning her own needs for someone else's emotional narrative. But her therapist wasn't sitting in a corner coffee shop in Brooklyn looking at a man who'd somehow become real to her in the span of 2 hours. "If we do this," Rachel said carefully, "it has to be transparent. No sneaking around the office. No pretending this isn't happening. If people are going to know, I'd rather control the narrative than have it be gossip." "Agreed," David said immediately. "I'll speak to HR tomorrow. I'll make it clear that this is a personal relationship and that we've taken steps to ensure no professional conflicts of interest. They're still going to think this is weird, undoubtedly, but they're also going to eventually accept it because we'll give them no other choice by being professional and competent and not making anyone uncomfortable with public displays of affection at work." Rachel smiled slightly. "You've really thought about this." "I've really thought about this," he confirmed. "I've also thought about the fact that I currently exist in a world where I'm incredibly lonely, and that loneliness is wearing on me in ways I was only aware of when you pointed it out in an elevator. I've thought about how rare it is to meet someone who sees you clearly and doesn't immediately leave or try to change you. And I've thought about how I'm not young enough to waste time on logic when the human part of me is screaming to take the risk. Rachel reached across the table and took his hand. The gesture felt both incredibly public and incredibly intimate. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" David's eyebrows rose slightly. "Okay, let's do this. Let's see if what happened in the elevator is real, or if it was just two trapped people finding comfort in each other's company. Let's see if you're as interesting when you're not trapped as you are when you have no escape route. Let's see if I can handle dating my boss without developing stress-related ulcers." "That's a very Rachel way of saying yes to a relationship," David said, but he was smiling. "I'm being realistic. This is probably going to be complicated. There are going to be moments where we regret this decision. But I'm tired of making safe choices just because they're safe. I'm tired of being invisible, and I think you might be tired of being lonely." "I am," he confirmed. "Profoundly tired." They stayed in the coffee shop for another 2 hours, talking about everything and nothing: childhood stories, professional ambitions, books they'd loved, movies they'd cried at, the specific way light looked in different neighborhoods of the city. It was the kind of conversation that only works when you're not also managing attraction, but Rachel discovered that it worked fine anyway. The attraction was just underneath everything, a current running beneath the words. When they finally left, David walked her to the subway station. They stopped at the entrance, and for a moment Rachel thought he might kiss her. But instead, he just held her hand and said, "Thank you for trusting this, for trusting me. I know it's not the safe choice." "Safe is overrated," Rachel said. The office on Monday morning was a different creature. Rachel had spent the weekend preparing for the awkwardness, but she'd underestimated how quickly news traveled through the 42nd floor. She arrived at her desk to find Mira practically vibrating with barely contained information. "Oh my God," Mira said the moment Rachel sat down. "You and David Harrington in the elevator for 3 hours, and apparently now you're together." Rachel set her bag down carefully. "Who told you that?" "David sent an email to the entire floor about professional relationships and how they're monitored and how everyone should respect boundaries and be professional, which is the corporate equivalent of announcing a relationship on a billboard in Times Square." Mira leaned back in her chair, grinning. "So, spill. Is he as intense one-on-one as he is in meetings?" Mira, I can't really." "Oh, come on, you can tell me. I've been keeping secrets for you since you started here." Mira lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Also, Brandon called on Friday asking if you were okay. Apparently he heard you were trapped in an elevator, and he wanted to make sure you weren't traumatized. It was extremely insincere, and I told him to fuck off." Rachel felt a small surge of affection for her deskmate. "He's fine," Rachel said carefully. He's good. It's complicated, but it's real, and I'm going to see where it goes." "That's all I need to hear," Mira said, turning back to her own work. "Also, for what it's worth, I think it's kind of romantic. Very different from your usual pattern, which is usually guy who makes me feel small, and then I spend 6 months processing the trauma. Thanks for the brutal honesty. That's what friends do." Rachel worked through the morning in a state of heightened awareness, hyper-conscious of every time David's name appeared in her email or every moment she heard his voice somewhere in the building. At noon, she received an email with no subject line. "Lunch. There's a restaurant I like that's not frequented by anyone from the office. It's in Tribeca." She responded, "Yes." The restaurant was small and expensive and exactly the kind of place Rachel would never have gone to on her own. David was already seated when she arrived, and he stood to greet her, which felt both courteous and slightly formal. "I wanted to see you in daylight," he said as they sat. "In the context of normal life. Not just in the margins of the office or the evening hours after work. I wanted to make sure that what I feel isn't just a response to proximity." "And?" Rachel asked carefully. "And it's not. You're sitting across from me in a well-lit restaurant, and I still want to spend time with you. Still find you interesting. Still feel like my chest is tighter when you smile." He paused. That's not good poetry, but it's honest. It's good poetry, Rachel said softly. It's the kind of poetry that means something. They ordered food and talked about safer things. The elevator incident had been major infrastructure failure. The building was implementing new backup systems. Several people had seen them emerge together, and the gossip was already circulating but seemed relatively benign. Rachel's job was secure. David's authority wasn't questioned. Everything was technically fine. I want to introduce you to my mother, David said over dessert. I know it's fast, but I also know that she's going to find out about this somehow, and I'd rather control the narrative than have her hear it from someone else. Won't she think this is strange? Her son dating an employee? Probably. But she also wants me to be happy, and I haven't been happy in a way that was visible to her in several years. She's going to see this as hope. He paused. Is that okay? Meeting my mother? Rachel thought about saying no. She thought about establishing boundaries and taking things slowly and not letting this escalate too quickly. But she was discovering that she was tired of being cautious in ways that didn't actually protect her. Okay, she said, but fair warning. I'm probably going to be nervous and say something inappropriate. I'm counting on it, David said. 2 weeks later, Rachel stood in the elevator of David's building, a different elevator, not the one that had started everything, heading to his apartment on the 50th floor. She'd been to his office building several times now, always arriving through different entrances, always leaving at different times, managing the optics of their relationship in a way that was becoming exhausting and necessary in equal measure. His apartment was larger than her entire building. It was also aggressively empty, expensive furniture, high ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and very little evidence of actual human habitation. It felt like a showroom designed to demonstrate wealth rather than a place where someone actually lived. It's horrible, David said, watching her take it in. I know. I've been meaning to make it feel more like home, but I never have a good reason to spend time here. Usually I come home after work, eat something and sleep. That's sad, Rachel said. It's very sad. He took her hand. But I think that might change now. They spent the evening making the apartment slightly more human. They opened the expensive wine he'd been saving for some occasion that never came. They ordered Thai food from a restaurant David apparently loved. They sat on his floor instead of his designer furniture and talked until late. At some point, Rachel asked, "Are you happy?" David didn't answer immediately. He was quiet for a long time, his head resting against the window, looking out at the city lights. "I'm happier than I've been in years," he finally said, "which is a lower bar than it should be. But it's the truth. You make me happier, Rachel. Just by being here, just by being you, this person who sees me clearly and doesn't run away from what she sees." Rachel felt something settle in her chest. Not the anxiety about whether this was real, not the worry about professional complications, not the fear that she was making a mistake. Just a quiet sense of rightness, of being in the right place with the right person at the right time. "I'm happy too," she said. "Even though this is messy and complicated and probably going to be harder than a normal relationship." "It will be harder," David agreed. "But it started in an elevator during a power outage, which means we're already operating outside the normal parameters. Why stop now?" Rachel laughed and leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat together looking out at Manhattan, two people who'd entered the city's tallest building and found something real in the smallest, most confined space. David's mother was nothing like Rachel had anticipated. She was smaller than expected, with silver hair cut in a precise bob, and the kind of smile that suggested she'd spent a lifetime managing disappointment with grace. They met at a restaurant in the Upper East Side. Not the trendy kind of place, but the established kind, where waiters knew your name, and the wine list was longer than most novels. "Rachel," Elizabeth Harrington said, standing to greet her with a genuine warmth that immediately made Rachel's anxiety worse. Genuine warmth meant she was being evaluated. David's told me very little, which means he's either terrified I'll disapprove or he's protecting you from knowing how much he's been talking about you. Mom, David said, a note of warning in his voice. I'm not being inappropriate. I'm being realistic. Elizabeth gestured for Rachel to sit. My son has not brought a woman to meet me in 7 years. The last one was perfectly nice and completely wrong for him, which I told him at the time, and he eventually figured out. So I'm assuming this one is either actually right for him, or so wrong that it's entertaining to watch. Rachel couldn't help but smile. I appreciate the honesty. Good. Honesty is the only thing that matters at this level of complication. Elizabeth ordered wine without consulting anyone. So, Rachel Torres, David's administrative assistant who somehow became trapped in an elevator with my son for 3 hours and emerged in a relationship. That's an interesting origin story. It was unexpected, Rachel admitted. The best things always are. Elizabeth turned to David. You look happier. You've looked miserable for 3 years. Since your father's final ultimatum, this is the first time I've seen you look like you're actually enjoying your life rather than just maintaining it. David's jaw tightened slightly. Can we not make this about my relationship with Dad? I'm not making it about anything. I'm observing. Elizabeth took a sip of wine. Rachel, has David mentioned his father? Elizabeth, David said sharply. He has, Rachel said, cutting through the tension. He mentioned that they have different visions for the company and that the relationship is strained. I also understand that there are family complications that are ongoing. Elizabeth nodded approvingly. At least you're getting context. That's better than the last one, who thought David was just being dramatic. She set down her wineglass. I'm going to say something that David probably doesn't want me to say, but it's important that you hear it directly from me. Mom, David started. My son is afraid that he's like his father, Elizabeth continued, speaking directly to Rachel now, ignoring her son's protest. He's afraid that he's fundamentally incapable of putting someone else's needs above his own, that he's selfish in the way his father is selfish, that any relationship he's in will eventually become about control and ego rather than actual connection. This fear is why he maintains distance. This fear is why he hasn't let anyone close in years. Rachel glanced at David, who looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. The truth, Elizabeth said, is that David is nothing like his father. But I think he needs to hear that from someone other than me, someone without biological bias. So Rachel, whatever this is between you two, whatever you decide about it, I want you to know that my son is capable of genuine care. He's capable of putting someone else first. He's just terrified to try. The dinner continued in a less loaded way after that, though the weight of Elizabeth's words hung over everything. By the time they left, Rachel felt like she'd been evaluated and approved, which was both comforting and slightly terrifying. In the car home, David was quiet. I'm sorry about my mother, he finally said. Don't be. She was honest. She was also right. You're afraid of becoming your father. Rachel shifted in her seat to look at him. But she's also right, that you're not like him. You're different. How can you be sure? Because someone like your father wouldn't have spent hours in an elevator genuinely listening to someone else's problems. Someone like your father wouldn't transfer you out of his department to avoid professional conflicts. Someone like your father wouldn't look at me the way you do, like I matter, like my thoughts and feelings actually shape how you move through the world. David's hands tightened on the steering wheel. I don't know if I can do this long-term, Rachel. I don't know if I can be what you need. Nobody knows that, Rachel said quietly. That's not how relationships work. You just show up and try and see if it's possible. But the doubt had been planted, and over the next week it grew. It started small. David was in more meetings. He was working later. The evening coffees they'd begun taking together were moved to lunch, then to brief check-ins at work that felt increasingly professional and distant. Rachel told herself it was normal, that relationships had their rhythms. that this was just a natural cooling after the intensity of the beginning. Then Brandon showed up again. This time he came directly to her desk. "Hey," he said, leaning against her cubicle wall with the kind of casual confidence that had always made her stomach twist. "Long time. I heard you've been busy." Rachel's professional mask slid into place. "Hi, Brandon. If you need a file, you can contact the reception desk. Actually, I came to see you." He lowered his voice slightly. "I heard you're dating David Harrington. That's quite the move, Rachel. Very different from you." "My personal life isn't your business," Rachel said coolly. "I'm not saying it is, I'm just saying it's interesting. David Harrington has a reputation, you know. He doesn't do committed relationships. He doesn't do anything that requires actual vulnerability. So either you're different or he's using you to seem more human." Brandon smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd practiced being charming enough to hurt. "Just wanted to give you a heads up. Wouldn't want you getting hurt again." Rachel's hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "Is there anything else?" "No, I think that's it. Just looking out for you, like I always did." "A deal." After he left, Rachel sat at her desk for a long time, trying to ignore the voice in her head that sounded exactly like Brandon, telling her that David was going to leave, that she was foolish to trust him, that she was making another mistake. She didn't tell David about the conversation. She told herself it was because it wasn't important, but really it was because she was afraid that David would confirm what Brandon had said. That night, David came to her apartment in Brooklyn instead of asking her to his penthouse. They ordered pizza and watched a movie neither of them was really paying attention to. Halfway through, Rachel said, "Do you think this is working?" David paused the movie. "What? Us? Do you think we can actually make this work, or is this just the elevator effect wearing off?" "What's bringing this up?" David asked carefully. Rachel could have said, "Brandon came to see me and planted doubt in my head about whether you're capable of real commitment," but instead she said, "I'm just being realistic. We come from different worlds, David. You have a company to run. I work in administrative support. You live on the 50th floor of the most expensive building in Manhattan. I have a studio in Brooklyn. This was never going to be simple, and maybe it's getting too hard. Are you breaking up with me?" David's voice was very quiet. "I'm asking if you want to break up with me. Because you've been pulling away for a week, and I think we both know why. You're afraid. Your mother said so, and you know it's true. And I can't be with someone who's waiting for the moment to leave." David stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Brooklyn. "My father spent his entire life running from anything that required him to be vulnerable. He built walls and then spent decades protecting those walls instead of actually living. I watched that happen, and I swore I would be different, but when it comes down to it, I'm terrified that I'm exactly like him. And being with you, being in something real with someone who matters, that terrifies me because I don't know if I cannot destroy it." Rachel felt tears prick her eyes. "So you're going to destroy it preemptively instead? That's not different from your father. That's exactly what he would do." "I know," David said, and he sounded exhausted. "I know that's what I'm doing. I just don't know how to stop." "You stop by deciding that the fear is worth it," Rachel said. "You stop by showing up anyway. You stop by choosing me even though it's scary." David turned to look at her. "What if I can't?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and final. "Then I guess we have our answer," Rachel said quietly. They didn't break up that night, but they didn't really stay together either. Over the next 2 weeks, they existed in a strange limbo. Still together technically, but with an increasing distance that felt less like careful space and more like active withdrawal. At work, people noticed. Mira gave Rachel sympathetic looks over her cubicle wall. David made sure all their interactions were professional and public. Rachel began to wonder if Brandon had been right all along, if David was incapable of real commitment, if she'd been foolish enough to believe that 3 hours in an elevator could change someone's fundamental nature. Then, 3 weeks after the conversation in her apartment, Rachel received a call from Elizabeth Harrington. My son is being an idiot, Elizabeth said without preamble. A well-intentioned idiot, but an idiot nonetheless. Mrs. Harrington, Elizabeth, and I'm not calling to mediate or to convince you to take him back. I'm calling because I think you should know what's actually happening. Elizabeth took a breath. David is in therapy with his regular therapist twice a week right now, trying to work through his fear of becoming his father. He's also apparently been talking to his father for the first time in 3 years, not to reconcile, but to understand something about himself. He's doing the work, Rachel. He's just doing it while being too afraid to ask you to wait. Rachel's heart was doing complicated things. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know that his pulling away isn't about you. It's about him trying to fix the broken parts of himself before he's comfortable letting you see them. It's still the wrong approach. He should let you in while he's doing that work. But it comes from a place of wanting to protect you, not from wanting to leave. After Elizabeth hung up, Rachel sat at her desk and had a quiet moment of clarity. She could wait for David to fix himself. She could trust that his fear didn't mean he didn't love her. Or she could do what she'd been terrified to do since they met. She could take the risk of being the one who said it first. Rachel found David in his office late that evening, working through documents with the kind of focus that suggested he was using work as a distraction from thinking about anything important. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. David looked up and Rachel saw the exhaustion in his face, not just physical but emotional, the exhaustion of someone trying to carry something heavy alone. "I know," David said. "I've been wanting to talk for days. I just didn't know how to say it without hurting you more." "Say what?" Rachel walked over to his desk and sat on the edge of it, a gesture that would have been unprofessional 3 months ago, but felt necessary now. "That I love you," David said quietly, "and that loving you terrifies me more than anything else ever has. Because I'm afraid that I'm going to fail you. I'm afraid that I'm going to become my father and hurt you the way he hurt my mother. I'm afraid that my capacity for love is limited in ways I don't understand yet. And I've been pulling away because I thought if I hurt you less gradually, it would be better than hurting you all at once." Rachel felt tears spill over before she could stop them. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard." "I know. Let me finish," Rachel said. "It's stupid because love isn't something you manage by distance. It's not something you protect by withdrawing. It's something you build by showing up, even when you're terrified, even when you don't have all the answers." "Rachel, I love you too," Rachel said. "And yes, I'm terrified. I'm terrified that you're going to realize that I'm not what you wanted. I'm terrified that we're going to crash and burn spectacularly. But I'm also more terrified of not trying, of letting fear win, of spending my life wondering what would have happened if I'd just been brave enough to stay." David stood and pulled her off the desk, holding her close enough that Rachel could feel his heart racing as fast as hers. "I can't promise I won't mess this up," he said into her hair. "I know, and I can't promise I won't either, but I promise I'll show up. I promise I'll try. I promise that when you're afraid, I'll be there anyway." "That's all I need," David said. "Just that. Just you staying." They stood together in his office, high above the city, and Rachel realized that sometimes the most important moments aren't the dramatic ones. Sometimes they're just two people deciding that the risk is worth it. Sometimes they're just someone saying, "I love you," and someone else choosing to believe it. 3 months later, Rachel stood in David's penthouse apartment, their penthouse apartment now, though the lease was still technically in his name, hanging curtains. Real curtains, not the minimalist shears that had previously adorned the windows, but the kind that actually blocked light and made the space feel like somewhere humans lived, rather than somewhere humans displayed their wealth. The apartment had transformed gradually. First came the books, Rachel's books, moving from her studio in Brooklyn in careful trips, filling the previously empty shelves with worn copies of novels and poetry collections and self-help books that David gently mocked but secretly read. Then came the art, Not the expensive pieces that had hung on the walls when Rachel first arrived, but smaller things that mattered. A print from a gallery in Williamsburg that they'd visited together, a watercolor that Elizabeth had painted, a photograph of Rachel and David on the steps of the building, both of them laughing at something now forgotten. Then came the kitchen equipment. David didn't cook, had never seen a need to when restaurants would deliver whatever he wanted. But Rachel cooked. Not professionally, not even particularly well, but with intent and care. She'd made pasta on a Tuesday evening, burned the sauce slightly, and David had eaten it like it was the finest meal he'd ever had. Now the kitchen had proper knives and a cutting board that wasn't decorative, and the faint smell of garlic that never quite disappeared. The penthouse was becoming a home. "How are those looking?" David called from the living room, where he was supposedly working, but was actually scrolling through his phone, stealing glances at her. "Good," Rachel said, stepping back to examine her work. The curtains were a soft grey that let light filter through but created actual separation from the outside world. "I think this actually makes it feel like a real room now instead of a photography shoot." "I liked it before," David said, but he was smiling. "But I like it better now. I like it better with you here." And it was the kind of thing he said casually now, without the careful weight of those early declarations. Rachel had learned that love, when it was real and functional, was actually quite ordinary. It was curtains and burnt pasta sauce. It was him doing the dishes while she sat on the counter and read articles from the internet aloud. It was her knowing exactly how he liked his coffee, and him remembering that she preferred tea on Tuesday mornings for reasons neither of them fully understood. "Your father called my office yesterday," Rachel said, moving to the next window. "Your secretary told me he wanted to speak with you." David's expression shifted slightly. "What did he say?" "Nothing specific. But apparently he's been calling regularly, and you've been having him transferred to voicemail." David set down his phone. "He wants me to rehire him as a consultant. He framed it as wanting to help, but really, it's about regaining control. He thinks that if he can reinsert himself into the company, he can start influencing decisions again." "Are you considering it?" "No," David said. "But I'm also not entirely closing the door the way I was before. My therapist and I have been talking about the possibility of a limited relationship with him, one that has clear boundaries and doesn't require me to absorb his need for dominance." Rachel nodded. This was the thing that had taken the longest to understand about David. He didn't make dramatic gestures. He made small shifts in perspective, incremental changes in how he approached things. The man who'd pulled away in fear wasn't gone, but he was learning to move toward people instead of away from them when he was afraid. "What do you want to do about it?" Rachel asked. "I want to call him," David said. "And I want you to come with me, because I need to know that I'm not alone in this conversation, and also because I want him to understand that what I have with you isn't something he can undermine with suggestions and criticisms." Rachel felt something settle in her chest. This was trust, not the dramatic kind that happened in elevators, but the quiet kind that built over months of showing up. "Okay," she said. "I'll come." David's father lived on the Upper West Side in a townhouse that looked like it had been decorated by someone who'd read every article about sophisticated minimalism and followed the instructions with aggressive precision. Everything was beige or white or chrome. Everything was expensive. Nothing was warm. Richard Harrington was taller than Rachel expected, with the kind of posture that suggested he'd spent his entire life physically bracing against the world. He looked at Rachel with an expression of polite dismissal. She was clearly not relevant to whatever narrative he'd constructed about his son. "David," he said, embracing his son in a way that looked performative, "I'm glad you called. We have a lot to discuss about the future of the company." "We do," David said, "but not about the company, about our relationship, and about establishing boundaries that will allow us to have one that's healthy." Richard's expression flickered with irritation. "This isn't the time for therapy speak." "It's exactly the time for it," David said calmly. I've spent 3 months working with a therapist on understanding my own patterns and my fears. I've learned that a lot of my behavior, the distance I maintain, the walls I build, comes from watching how you operated and deciding I never wanted to be that way. But I also learned that avoiding you entirely isn't a solution. It's just another kind of wall. Rachel watched Richard's face as he processed this. She could see the moment he realized that his son wasn't going to be controlled or manipulated into compliance. "If you're here because she told you to," Richard began, gesturing dismissively at Rachel. "She didn't," David said. "She's here because I asked her to be. Rachel is my partner. She's someone whose opinion I value and whose presence matters to me. So if you're going to have a relationship with me, you need to be respectful of her." "I don't know this woman," Richard said flatly. "Then you should, because she's going to be in my life regardless. The question is whether you want to be in it too, on my terms, with clear boundaries, or not at all." Richard turned away, his jaw tight. For a long moment nobody spoke. When Richard finally turned back, his expression had shifted into something more vulnerable. It wasn't warmth exactly, but it was the closest thing to genuine emotion Rachel had seen from him. "I was afraid," he said quietly. "When you took over the company, I was afraid that you would undo everything I'd built. And when you started making different choices, different decisions, I thought I was failing. So I pushed harder, tried to maintain control, because in my mind, that's what leadership meant. That's what I understood it to mean." "I know," David said, "and I understand that now. But that approach doesn't work anymore. It won't work with me, and it won't work with the company. Things have changed, and clinging to how things used to be will only destroy what we still have." "Can you forgive me?" Richard asked. Rachel held her breath. This was the moment where David's answer would determine everything. Whether he could actually do what he'd been working toward in therapy, whether he could move beyond fear and resentment towards something more functional. "I can," David said slowly, "but it's going to take time, and I'm not going to compromise my own well-being or the people I care about in order to make you comfortable. Those are the terms." Richard nodded, and Rachel saw something break open in his expression, not collapse, but a kind of surrender. The realization that control was never really possible, that love sometimes meant letting go. "Okay," Richard said, "those are acceptable terms." On the drive back to the penthouse, David was quiet. Rachel let him be quiet, understanding that he was processing something significant. When they arrived back at the apartment, he pulled her close before she could even take off her coat. "Thank you," he said into her hair. "For what?" "For being there, for not trying to fix it, for just being present." Rachel pulled back so she could look at him. "This is what love is, David. It's just being present. You've been learning that for 3 months. I think you've finally got it." David smiled, a real smile, not the performative one he'd perfected for business contexts. "I think I might have, though I'll probably need reminders periodically." "I can do that," Rachel said. "I can remind you as many times as you need." Spring came to Manhattan with the kind of intensity that made the city feel new. Rachel and David fell into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Work, evenings together, weekends exploring neighborhoods they'd never been to, dinners with Elizabeth, who'd become something like family, quiet mornings with coffee and newspapers, and absolutely no requirement to be anywhere. At the office, they'd managed to create a system that worked. Rachel had been transferred to a different department, reporting to a different manager, which eliminated the power dynamic entirely. She still worked for the same company, still had access to the same opportunities, but the professional complication had been resolved. The gossip had died down once people realized they were a genuinely functional couple rather than a scandal. One evening in late May, Rachel was working on reports at the penthouse when David emerged from his study, looking nervous. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. Rachel's heart did a complicated flip. This was the phrasing people used before big announcements. Big announcements could be good or bad. "Okay," she said carefully. I've been thinking about stepping back from the day-to-day running of the company, David said, bringing in a CEO to manage operations while I focus on strategy and long-term vision. It would give me more time to actually live my life instead of just managing my company. That sounds good, Rachel said. Are you asking for my opinion or telling me what you've decided? Asking, David said. Because your opinion matters to me, and also because I was hoping you might consider moving to the marketing department. Higher position, more responsibility, better pay. They've been wanting to recruit you for months. I've been stopping them because it felt complicated, but it's not complicated anymore. You should go where your talent is valued. Rachel felt something warm unfurl in her chest. You're really serious about changing things. I am. I spent the first 32 years of my life managing everyone else's expectations and building walls to protect myself from disappointment. I'm done with that. I want to build something different. With you, with the company, with my family. Something that's actually worth the effort. Okay, Rachel said. I'll take the marketing position. And I think stepping back from day-to-day operations is a good move. You'll be happier. David pulled her up from the couch and led her to the windows. The city was lit up below them. Millions of lights in the darkness, millions of individual stories playing out across 5 boroughs. I have something I wanted to show you, he said. He pulled out his phone and showed her photos of a brownstone in Park Slope. 4 stories, with windows that actually looked onto a tree-lined street, with space for both of them to have offices, with a small garden in the back. What is this? Rachel asked. A house, David said. Our house, if you want it. I know we haven't been together that long. I know it's a big step. But I'm done with the penthouse. I'm done with trying to prove something through square footage and skyline views. I want to live in a place that feels like home, and I want to live there with you. Rachel stared at the photos, at the reality of what David was proposing. Are you asking me to move in with you? She asked. I'm asking if you want to build a life with me, David said. In a house that we choose together, with a kitchen where you can burn as much pasta sauce as you want, with rooms for books and art and all the things that make a place feel like it actually belongs to people rather than just containing them. Rachel thought about the elevator. She thought about the 3-hour conversation that had changed everything. She thought about the months of learning to trust, of choosing each other repeatedly, of building something real from circumstances that were completely implausible. Yes, she said. Yes to the house. Yes to the life. Yes to all of it. David kissed her then, and it wasn't dramatic or perfect or anything like what happens in movies. It was tender and genuine and tasted like the coffee he'd been drinking and smelled like the city and felt like coming home. 6 months later, on a Saturday in November, Rachel stood in the kitchen of their brownstone in Park Slope, making pasta sauce. It was slightly burnt, exactly as David preferred it now. She could hear him in his study next door, on a video call with the new CEO of his company, discussing quarterly results in a tone that was professional, but no longer carried the weight of proving something. The house was still being decorated, still in that phase where it was becoming a home rather than just a place where 2 people lived. But it already felt right. The bookshelves were full. The kitchen smelled like her. The bedrooms had been painted the colors they'd chosen together. There were photographs of them on the walls, some from the building where they'd met, some from dinners and weekends, some from the day they'd first seen the house. Rachel's phone buzzed, a text from Mira. Still can't believe you're dating the boss. Or I guess ex-boss now. How is that working out? Rachel smiled and typed back, better than anyone could have predicted. Come by the house next month. We're doing a dinner party. The pasta finished cooking. Rachel drained it and mixed it with the burnt sauce, which was now exactly the color David loved. She heard his footsteps as he came out of his study, heard him stop in the doorway of the kitchen. That smells perfect, he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind in a way that had become familiar and comfortable. It's exactly the same as always, Rachel said. Exactly, David said. That's the point. They ate dinner sitting at the small table in their kitchen, looking out at the street where people were walking home from wherever they'd been, all of them moving through their own stories, their own complications, their own versions of figuring out how to love someone in a world that made it difficult. "I was thinking," David said as they cleared dishes, "about that elevator. What about it? How random it was. How if the power hadn't gone out, or if you'd left 5 minutes earlier, or if I'd taken a different elevator, we never would have met. And I realized that the randomness is actually the point. Life isn't meant to be controlled or managed. It's meant to be lived in the moments where things surprise you." Rachel dried dishes and handed them to David to put away in cabinets that were becoming familiar in the way of things you use every day. "We were very unlikely," she agreed. "Boss and employee. Completely different worlds. On paper it made no sense. And yet," David said, "here we are, living in a brownstone in Brooklyn, making burnt pasta sauce. Actually happy in a way that isn't contingent on everything being perfect." "Is it perfect?" Rachel asked. "No," David said honestly. "It's not perfect. We still fight about stupid things. You still steal the blankets. I still work too many hours sometimes. My father still says things that hurt. Your ex still occasionally haunts your dreams." "But," Rachel prompted. "But it's real," David said. "And real is better than perfect. Real means it can last. Real means it's actually worth something, because we're choosing it every day despite everything that would make it easier to walk away." Rachel finished the dishes and turned to face him. After 6 months, after moving in together, after making a life that spanned from Brooklyn to Manhattan and back again, the attraction was still there, but it had transformed into something deeper. It was the attraction of recognizing someone as fundamentally right, not because they made you feel good all the time, but because they made you feel real. "I love you," she said, the words that had become as familiar as burnt pasta sauce and stolen blankets, and the particular way he smiled when he was thinking about something. "I love you too," David said. "I love you in the elevator when everything was impossible, and I love you here in our kitchen where everything is possible. I love you in all the versions of us that exist in the space between those two moments." They moved to the living room, where the fire was burning in the fireplace they'd discovered when they first saw the house. Rachel curled against David on the couch that they'd chosen together from a vintage furniture store in Williamsburg. Outside, the city continued its endless movement. People were falling in love and falling out of love. People were making decisions that would change their lives. People were running from things and toward things and standing still, trying to figure out which direction to move. But inside their brownstone, in the space that was slowly becoming theirs, Rachel and David existed in the quiet satisfaction of having found each other in the most unlikely of places. The elevator that had started everything felt very far away now, but it was also right here, in every decision they'd made since stepping out of it, in the choice to be brave, in the choice to be honest, in the choice to build something real from circumstances that were completely impossible. Rachel closed her eyes and listened to David's heartbeat, steady and present and right. Outside, Manhattan hummed with its endless energy. But here, in this moment, in this house, in this life they'd built together, there was only the quiet contentment of two people who'd learned to be present with each other, to love without walls, to trust that the random, impossible things sometimes worked out if you were brave enough to let them. The elevator doors had opened 3 months ago. Rachel had stepped out thinking she was escaping something. Instead, she'd walked directly into the thing she'd been too afraid to even look for. And that, she thought, as she drifted toward sleep, was better than any perfectly planned romance could ever be.